Historical records indicate that the Safavid court of early modern Iran functioned not only as a center of imperial administration, but also as a carefully regulated domestic environment in which marriage operated as a political instrument. Palace chronicles, diplomatic correspondence, legal decrees, and later historiographical compilations collectively reveal that royal women occupied a paradoxical position. They were simultaneously removed from public visibility and deeply embedded in mechanisms of dynastic continuity, factional negotiation, and territorial governance. Within this framework, marriages involving Safavid princesses were rarely private unions. Instead, they formed part of a broader strategy through which the dynasty managed loyalty, neutralized rival power centers, and reinforced hierarchical relationships within the empire's elite structure. Contemporary accounts describe how the Safavid state inherited and adapted earlier Turco-Mongol and Persian traditions in which royal women played essential diplomatic roles. Chroniclers noted that Safavid shahs frequently arranged marriages between princesses and influential tribal leaders, military commanders, or provincial governors. Surviving documents suggest that such unions were designed to stabilize alliances with Kizilbash tribal factions, whose military support had enabled the Safavids' rise to power in the early 16th century. The necessity of balancing these factions created an environment in which royal women's marital choices were subordinated to the preservation of political equilibrium. Legal codes of the period reveal that Safavid marriage arrangements involving royal women were governed by both Islamic jurisprudence and court protocol. While Islamic law recognized women's consent as a formal component of marriage contracts, palace chronicles indicate that the practical exercise of this consent was often constrained by dynastic priorities. Negotiations typically occurred among male relatives, court officials, and factional representatives, with princesses informed of arrangements after key decisions had already been made. Chroniclers noted that the language of consent remained present in official documentation, yet the surrounding administrative procedures limited opportunities for refusal without significant personal or political consequences. The lived realities of Safavid royal women were shaped by the institutional structure of the royal harem, which functioned as a controlled environment with its own hierarchy, economic resources, and channels of influence. Surviving administrative records suggest that senior female relatives of the Shah, including queen mothers and influential aunts, often supervised the upbringing and marital futures of younger princesses. These senior women sometimes acted as intermediaries in marriage negotiations, reflecting a complex internal power dynamic in which female authority operated within the broader constraints of male-dominated governance. Chroniclers noted that while this internal influence could shape the selection of spouses, it rarely altered the fundamental political motivations behind the unions. European diplomatic observers stationed at the Safavid court provided additional insight into the strategic nature of these marriages. Their correspondence frequently described royal weddings as events closely tied to shifts in provincial authority or military command. Historical records indicate that when powerful governors demonstrated loyalty, or when reconciliation with a previously rebellious faction became necessary, marriage alliances involving princesses often followed. These observers interpreted such arrangements as mechanisms through which the Shah converted potentially autonomous elites into relatives bound by familial obligation and court oversight. Surviving documents suggest that forced or highly constrained marriages also functioned as tools of containment. Safavid political culture displayed persistent anxiety regarding the concentration of power outside the immediate royal household. Marrying princesses to selected individuals allowed the court to monitor influential men through kinship ties while simultaneously ensuring that potential rivals remained dependent on royal favor. Chroniclers noted that in some cases, these husbands were required to reside near the court or maintain regular contact with imperial administrators, effectively transforming marital relationships into instruments of surveillance and control. The emotional dimensions of these arrangements remain difficult to reconstruct, yet palace chronicles occasionally allude to resistance, negotiation, and adaptation. Some accounts describe princesses who leveraged their new positions to secure patronage networks, charitable endowments, or educational initiatives, suggesting that agency persisted even within constrained circumstances. Surviving Waqf documents reveal that certain royal women established religious and social institutions following marriage, indicating efforts to shape their public legacy and maintain influence beyond domestic roles. These activities illustrate how royal women navigated imposed marital arrangements by cultivating alternative forms of authority grounded in piety, philanthropy, and courtly reputation. Chroniclers also noted that forced marriages sometimes carried unintended political consequences. Alliances forged to stabilize relationships between the Shah and powerful factions could become sources of tension if expectations of patronage or autonomy were not met. Historical records indicate that disputes involving the relatives of married princesses occasionally escalated into factional rivalries within the court. In such instances, royal women found themselves positioned between competing loyalties, reinforcing the extent to which their marriages embedded them within broader political conflicts. The Safavid emphasis on lineage purity further complicated marital arrangements. Surviving genealogical records suggest that the dynasty carefully regulated marriages to preserve claims of sacred and noble ancestry associated with descent from the prophet's family. This concern limited potential spouses, while simultaneously increasing the political significance of each union. Chroniclers observed that marriages involving princesses were scrutinized not only for their immediate diplomatic value, but also for their implications for succession, legitimacy, and the symbolic authority of the ruling house. Accounts from the reign of Shah Abbas provide particularly detailed examples of the intersection between political centralization and royal marriages. Historical records indicate that Abbas sought to reduce the influence of Qizilbash tribal leaders by promoting a new administrative elite composed of converted slaves and bureaucrats. Within this transformation, marriages involving royal women were selectively employed to reward loyalty while preventing the emergence of hereditary power bases. Chroniclers noted that some princesses were married to individuals whose authority derived directly from the Shah's patronage rather than tribal lineage, reinforcing the centralizing objectives of Abbas's reforms. The palace environment itself reinforced compliance with these marital strategies. Contemporary descriptions of harem administration reveal strict protocols governing communication, movement, and access to information. While royal women could exercise cultural and economic influence within these confines, their ability to independently pursue alternative marital arrangements was limited. Surviving correspondence suggests that decisions regarding divorce, remarriage, or the reassignment of marital alliances were frequently subject to direct intervention by the Shah or senior court officials, underscoring the extent to which marriage functioned as a reversible instrument of policy rather than a permanent personal commitment. Despite these constraints, palace chronicles occasionally highlight instances in which royal women influenced the political trajectory of their marriages. Some princesses reportedly acted as mediators between their husbands and the court, facilitating negotiations during periods of tension. Chroniclers noted that the credibility of such mediation derived from their dual identity as both members of the ruling family and participants in external elite networks. This intermediary role demonstrates that forced marriages did not eliminate the capacity for political engagement, even as they restricted personal autonomy. The long-term effects of these marital practices extended beyond individual lifetimes. Historical records indicate that the descendants of such unions often occupied positions that blended provincial authority with close ties to the royal household, shaping patterns of governance across successive generations. At the same time, the recurrent use of marriage as a political instrument contributed to an atmosphere in which royal women's personal experiences were consistently subordinated to the perceived needs of dynastic stability. Surviving documents suggest that the Safavid approach to royal marriage reflected broader, early modern assumptions regarding sovereignty, kinship, and gendered responsibility. The court's reliance on controlled marital alliances reveals a political culture in which family structures were inseparable from administrative strategy. Chroniclers repeatedly emphasized loyalty, obedience, and the preservation of order as justifications for these arrangements, framing them as necessary components of imperial governance rather than exceptional impositions. Within this context, the Palace Chronicles offer a restrained yet revealing perspective on the lived realities of Safavid royal women. They depict individuals navigating an environment where personal agency coexisted with institutional constraint, and where marriage functioned simultaneously as a diplomatic contract, a mechanism of surveillance, and a means of redistributing power across the empire's elite networks. The cumulative weight of these accounts suggests that forced or highly constrained marriages were not peripheral practices, but integral elements of Safavid statecraft, shaping both the internal dynamics of the royal household and the broader political landscape of the dynasty. Surviving administrative correspondence indicates that once Safavid princesses entered politically arranged marriages, their daily lives became closely intertwined with the responsibilities and expectations attached to their husbands' positions. Marriage did not represent a withdrawal from the political sphere. Rather, it often repositioned royal women within new centers of authority that extended beyond the palace walls. Contemporary accounts describe how princesses relocated to provincial courts or semi-autonomous households while maintaining financial ties to the Safavid treasury, reflecting an arrangement that preserved both dependence and influence. These dual affiliations allowed the central court to project presence into distant regions while simultaneously monitoring the conduct of powerful governors through familial association. Chroniclers noted that the management of dowries and financial stipends formed a critical dimension of these marriages. Legal documents of the period reveal that royal dowries were frequently substantial, consisting of land grants, revenue assignments, luxury goods, and servants. These resources served multiple functions. They reinforced the prestige of the marriage alliance, provided economic security for the princess, and established a financial connection between provincial households and the imperial administration. Historical records suggest that control over these resources often remained subject to oversight by the central court, limiting the extent to which husbands could independently appropriate them. In this way, dowry arrangements operated as instruments of fiscal supervision embedded within marital frameworks. The physical relocation of princesses also introduced new layers of negotiation and adaptation. Surviving travel accounts describe carefully orchestrated movements between the capital and provincial residences, often accompanied by large entourages that preserved elements of courtly culture within regional settings. These movements were rarely voluntary in a personal sense. Instead, they reflected the administrative demands of alliance building. Chroniclers observed that the presence of a Safavid princess in a provincial environment could elevate the symbolic legitimacy of local governance, while simultaneously reminding regional elites of their connection to the central dynasty. At the same time, palace chronicles indicate that forced marriages exposed royal women to environments characterized by political volatility. Provincial courts were frequently sites of competition among tribal leaders, military commanders, and bureaucratic officials. Historical records suggest that princesses were expected to navigate these dynamics with discretion, maintaining loyalty to their natal family while supporting their husband's authority. This balancing act required careful management of correspondence, patronage, and household alliances. Some accounts describe royal women acting as conduits through which grievances, petitions, and intelligence reached the Safavid court, demonstrating that their marriages facilitated not only diplomatic relationships, but also information networks. The question of personal autonomy remained deeply constrained within these arrangements. Legal opinions preserved in Safavid judicial records suggest that while women possessed theoretical rights to seek divorce under certain circumstances, the exercise of such rights was complicated by political considerations when the individuals involved were members of the ruling family. Chroniclers noted that decisions regarding separation or remarriage were often mediated by the Shah or influential court figures, reflecting concerns that changes in marital status could disrupt carefully constructed alliances. Consequently, royal women's marital continuity frequently became a matter of state interest rather than personal choice. European observers offered additional testimony regarding the controlled nature of these marriages. Diplomatic reports often remarked upon the limited opportunities Safavid princesses had to influence the selection of spouses, describing negotiations conducted primarily among male relatives and court officials. Some observers interpreted the elaborate ceremonial aspects of royal weddings as efforts to publicly affirm harmony and legitimacy, even when private correspondence hinted at underlying tensions. While such accounts must be read with caution due to cultural misunderstandings, they nonetheless align with internal chronicles emphasizing the strategic objectives embedded in matrimonial decisions. The role of senior female figures within the Safavid court remained central to the management of these dynamics. Surviving memoirs and endowment records indicate that queen mothers and elder princesses frequently maintained correspondence with married royal women, offering guidance and occasionally intervening in disputes involving their husbands. This network of female kinship provided a degree of continuity between the palace and provincial households, reinforcing the idea that royal marriages extended rather than severed connections to the core of Safavid power. Chroniclers observed that the authority of these senior women could mitigate conflicts, particularly when their mediation aligned with the Shah's broader political interests. In some instances, historical records reveal that forced marriages served explicitly punitive functions. When members of the elite were suspected of disloyalty yet remained too influential to remove outright, marriage alliances involving royal women could be employed to bind them more closely to the dynasty. Chroniclers noted that such arrangements carried implicit expectations of obedience and surveillance. The presence of a princess within a household created both an honor and an obligation, making overt rebellion politically and symbolically more difficult. Surviving administrative correspondence suggests that this strategy reflected a preference for containment and integration rather than direct confrontation. At the same time, the marriages could generate vulnerabilities for the royal women themselves. Political instability affecting their husbands often translated into personal uncertainty, including the possibility of relocation, loss of resources, or shifts in household authority. Contemporary accounts describe situations in which the fall from favor of a provincial governor altered the circumstances of his Safavid wife, sometimes necessitating her return to the court under conditions shaped by ongoing factional struggles. These experiences illustrate how the political utility of marriage exposed royal women to the fluctuations inherent in Safavid elite politics. Chroniclers also recorded the significance of childbirth within these unions, emphasizing its role in reinforcing alliances and shaping succession dynamics. Surviving genealogical materials indicate that children born from such marriages could serve as intermediaries between provincial elites and the central dynasty, embodying both familial and political connections. However, these same dynamics introduced complexities regarding inheritance, legitimacy, and loyalty. Historical records suggest that the court closely monitored the upbringing and placement of these children, occasionally recalling them to the capital for education and integration into imperial service. This practice further demonstrates how marriage functioned as a mechanism through which the Safavid state extended its influence across generations. Religious institutions played a subtle yet meaningful role in shaping the experiences of married royal women. Waqf documents and charitable foundations established by Safavid princesses indicate efforts to cultivate spiritual authority and public respectability within their new environments. Chroniclers noted that such patronage could enhance a princess's standing independently of her husband's political fortunes, providing a form of stability amid uncertain circumstances. These activities also aligned with Safavid promotion of Shura'i religious identity, allowing royal women to contribute to the dynasty's ideological objectives while reinforcing their personal reputations for piety and benevolence. Despite the constraints surrounding these marriages, surviving narratives occasionally suggest moments of negotiation and adaptation that complicated the notion of complete passivity. Some chronicles describe princesses who influenced household appointments, mediated disputes among retainers, or leveraged their royal status to secure favorable outcomes for dependents. While these actions did not fundamentally alter the coercive aspects of their marital arrangements, they demonstrate that agency persisted in subtle forms embedded within everyday administrative and domestic practices. The Safavid court's reliance on controlled marriage alliances also intersected with broader transformations in imperial governance. As the dynasty navigated periods of centralization, military reform, and shifting factional balances, the strategic deployment of royal marriages evolved accordingly. Historical records from the later Safavid period suggest that as central authority weakened, the capacity of marriage alliances to guarantee loyalty diminished. Chroniclers noted instances in which kinship ties proved insufficient to prevent political fragmentation, highlighting the limitations of marital diplomacy as a long-term stabilizing mechanism. Nevertheless, palace chronicles consistently portray forced and politically constrained marriages as normalized components of Safavid political culture. They were embedded within a worldview that prioritized dynastic survival, territorial cohesion, and hierarchical order over individual preference. Surviving documents suggest that while these practices generated personal hardship and complex negotiations, they were rarely framed by contemporaries as extraordinary measures. Instead, they were understood as expressions of the reciprocal obligations linking the ruling family with the empire's military and administrative elites. Through these accounts, a more detailed picture emerges of how Safavid royal women experienced marriages shaped by institutional necessity. Their lives reveal patterns of movement between palace and province, participation in networks of mediation and patronage, and ongoing negotiation between personal circumstance and political expectation. The cumulative evidence indicates that forced marriages operated not merely as isolated arrangements, but as structural features of Safavid governance, influencing the distribution of power, the management of loyalty, and the lived realities of those positioned at the intersection of family and state. Historical records from the later Safavid period suggest that the cumulative effects of politically constrained marriages became increasingly visible as the dynasty faced mounting administrative and military pressures. Chroniclers noted that while such alliances had once functioned as reliable mechanisms for integrating tribal leaders and provincial elites into the Safavid order, shifting economic conditions and factional rivalries gradually reduced their effectiveness. Surviving documents indicate that royal women continued to be married into influential households, yet the capacity of these unions to guarantee loyalty became more uncertain as the balance of power within the empire evolved. The gradual weakening of central authority during the 17th century intensified the political stakes surrounding royal marriages. Contemporary accounts describe how provincial governors and military commanders accumulated localized influence that could not always be counterbalanced through kinship ties alone. In this environment, marriages involving Safavid princesses sometimes produced competing expectations rather than stable alliances. Chroniclers observed that husbands connected to the ruling family through marriage might simultaneously assert greater autonomy, interpreting the union as recognition of their status rather than as a mechanism of subordination. This ambiguity complicated the original intent behind such arrangements and occasionally contributed to tensions between provincial households and the court. Surviving correspondence reveals that the Safavid administration remained aware of these challenges and attempted to recalibrate the use of marital alliances accordingly. In some cases, the court delayed or avoided marriages that might strengthen already powerful factions, preferring instead to maintain princesses within the palace as potential instruments for future negotiations. Legal and administrative memoranda suggest that this cautious approach reflected a recognition that the political value of marriage depended heavily on timing, factional context, and the perceived reliability of prospective spouses. Such deliberation underscores the extent to which royal marriages were treated as strategic assets subject to careful calculation. The experiences of Safavid royal women during this period continued to reflect the intersection of personal constraint and political significance. Palace chronicles indicate that princesses who remained unmarried were not exempt from political utility. Their availability for future alliances positioned them within ongoing court deliberations regarding succession, reconciliation, and administrative reform. At the same time, chroniclers noted that prolonged unmarried status could limit opportunities for establishing independent households, charitable endowments, or regional influence, illustrating how both marriage and its absence carried implications for women's social and political roles. For those who did marry, the later Safavid period often introduced additional layers of instability. Historical records suggest that economic strain, administrative corruption, and military setbacks increased the likelihood that provincial authorities would experience abrupt changes in fortune. Princesses married into such households frequently encountered the consequences of these fluctuations, including reduced financial support, relocation, or altered relationships with court officials. Surviving petitions and administrative decisions indicate that the Safavid court sometimes intervened to protect the material security of royal women, particularly when the political utility of maintaining their dignity outweighed the costs involved. These interventions demonstrate that while marriages could expose princesses to vulnerability, their status continued to command a degree of institutional protection. Chroniclers also documented the role of widowhood within Safavid marital politics. The death or political downfall of a husband did not necessarily release a princess from the strategic considerations surrounding her marital status. Surviving legal opinions suggest that widowed royal women might be remarried to reinforce new alliances or consolidate existing ones, depending on the needs of the court. In other cases, widowhood enabled princesses to exercise greater control over charitable foundations, property management, and religious patronage, creating opportunities for a form of authority less directly tied to male relatives.